folks. Thanks so much for joining our Monday Mindshare again. We're still coming out of the mountains down in Chamonix in France, and wanted to spend today's show talking specifically to the ladies in our audience and our customers around the world, and specifically about fat oxidation for them. And there's a recent study that came out that was really interesting to us because it specifically looked at upregulating fat oxidation with caffeine for ladies. And, you know, we have a large contingent on successful endurance athletes all around the world, but particularly we're excited to help specifically answer the question of improving fat oxidation for males and for ladies, because there is differences, it would seem, as you get into the data. And specifically today, I wanted to talk about the use of caffeine for ladies and how that affects ladies to men. And for some time, we've been talking about the use of somewhere between 2.5 to 3 grams of, milligrams per kilogram of body weight of caffeine to upregulate fat oxidation. And in those studies, it was suggesting somewhere in the vicinity of 20% increase in fat oxidation as you used caffeine in that dosage prior to and during sub-maximal exercise. And by sub-maximal, meaning like, you know, typically anywhere up to probably 70-75% of your VO2 max. Now we know in racing, in whether it's triathlon up to Ironman distances, it typically is, you know, anywhere between Olympic distance, maybe closer to 80%. And as you get into Ironman, of course, that can be 70-75%, and half Ironman somewhere in the middle of that. And also as we get into marathons, it's probably more sitting in the 75% to 80% of VO2 max range of intensity. The reason I tell you all of that is because the way that caffeine works and what we're talking about is not, and it does work at maximal activity, but what we're specifically talking about is endurance racing, where it's typically sub-maximal, like I said, in that 70 to 80% range in most of the racing that goes on between marathons, ultras, and triathlon, whether it's Olympic distance, 70.3 or Ironman. Okay, so this particular study that we're looking at, and I'll bring that up on screen here on the video, as I said, looks at the dosages, and it looks at two different dosages, 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight versus 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. And, you know, is there a difference? Is there an improvement going from the 3 milligram up to the 6 milligram? Is there any adverse effects of taking as high as, you know, 6 milligram per kilogram of body weight? Now, just to put context to this, let's say you are a 70 kilogram lady. That would turn out to be 3 times then 70 milligrams. At 3 milligrams per kilogram, that would be 3 times that 70 kilograms. So 210 milligrams of caffeine would be required. And as we've said in prior videos, this typically would be taken each 6 hours thereabouts, in that the half-life of caffeine is about 6 hours. So when we looked at this study, there were some really interesting findings, and maybe just to jump straight to the effect and understand why this is really material and interesting as an aid on top of your fueling. Now, I don't want to take away from the fact that we still need to do a lot of zone 2 aerobic, long, slow distance training. By long, slow distance, we're talking 2, 3, 4 hour type sessions. This is what is going to test and trigger fat oxidation. We need to do that training, of course, in a low carbohydrate state. And we use our SFuels Train product to help facilitate that, in that it has little to no carbohydrate included. So it is really triggering the body to use its own fat oxidation stores, plus that MCT based fat that we provide in the SFuels Train product. Now that still has to happen, But with that as the baseline, we can further upregulate that fat oxidation efficiency by using caffeine. And in this study, when they tested this with women at 3 and 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, they found that in the case of 3 milligrams per kilogram body weight, they could increase that by 26%, which is a really material upregulation, of course, of fat oxidation efficiency. And the interesting thing with all of this, of course, is if we can use that fat at higher intensities more so, we can obviously preserve the use of our glycogen in liver and in muscle to latter parts of the race. Now let's take a look at an interesting part of this study, though, which was really questioning, though, that when you begin to dose at these dosages, what happens to potentially some of the adverse effects? And this is things like nervousness, vigor, meaning, like, if you will, embracing, in this case, the race, which is typically a stressful thing. How can you embrace that by using caffeine? And this is more affecting the cognitive functions. But there are other factors like irritability, muscle pain, headache, gastrointestinal distress, diuresis, insomnia, sleep quality. And all these things were evaluated in both the use of caffeine for 3 milligram and 6 milligram. And it was tested in terms of the 24 hours after consuming the caffeine, what happened to these potentially adverse effects. And we find that versus placebo, actually some of the more maybe obvious things that you may think were affected, like insomnia or inability to sleep or sleep quality, would be affected dramatically. And actually for the 3 milligram dose, it was actually superior. Whereas for the 6 milligram dose, it was about the same, not a lot of difference. And then you get into things like nervousness. There is a little bit more of that. And that is part of the dopaminergic effect of caffeine, where it is priming you, preparing you for some type of adverse, if you will, or stressful situation. And, vigor also, which is really a positive thing in the context of facing up to a race, 4 hour, 8 hour, 24, 40 hour endurance event ahead of us. Of course, this can be quite stressful, and obviously approaching that and embracing that with confidence is a good thing. And they were both improved through the use of caffeine. Irritability was about the same. There was actually a reduction in muscle pain, which actually does tie back to a number of other studies which talk about the improved reduction in the perceived exertion of exercise, the rate of perceived exertion. And we know caffeine has a strong role to play in actually reducing the rate of perceived exertion, and that's shown out in some of these studies. Headaches was not really an issue. It was basically the same. In fact, it was a little less. Gastrointestinal was a little less. Diuresis was a little more, and that is true. Caffeine is a slight diuretic. It's only mildly increased, not massive, but it is slightly. And I think that's important to think about in a racing context, that you may want to take a little more fluid if you are increasing the use of caffeine at the beginning of the race versus not taking it at all. So the key takeaways here, and you see this down in the discussion area of the paper, and that is that firstly, there is a very material upregulation of fat oxidation with caffeine, 26% with 3 milligrams per kilogram, and actually a little less than that with 6 milligrams per kilogram. It is thought that part of the reason why, as you went into that much higher dose, that there was even a reduced effect on fat oxidation is something to do with the way that the liver and the kidneys actually excrete caffeine at that higher dose. And it seemed to, at least in this study, suggest that the higher dose was not warranted in terms of improved fat oxidation. In fact, it was slightly lower. And I've talked through some of those adverse effects, which are very minor, if at all, but there's actually some positive effects outside of raw testing of fat oxidation efficiency. So all in all, it's a very interesting compound to add to your race formulation Now, the way we typically do and dose this, and we have this in our usage guide, and I'll put the link down below in the video, that is that you really want to be thinking of splitting up. So you don't want to, if you will, over dose it right at the beginning before the actual race is started. Generally, we suggest taking a third to a half prior to the start of the race, an hour prior to the start of the race. This is more as a cognitive primer, getting you ready to embrace the race, feel confident about the race ahead, and then take the other half or the other 2 doses in the first hour or hour and a half of the race. And depending upon the size of the race, of course, if this is a half Ironman, maybe it's 5-6 hours for you. A full Ironman, that could be 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 more hours. But you're really in that first few hours want to take the rest of that caffeine dose. And typically in a half Ironman, the swim is done in 30 to 60 minutes, etc. And in that period after the swim, when you first get on the bike, you should have your hydration set up with the remaining half or the remaining 2/3 of that caffeine. So let's say you had to take, it was 3 milligrams per kilogram body weight, you were 70 kilograms, or say you were 80 kilograms, so 240 milligrams is what you're looking for in caffeine. The SFuels PRIMED single sachet is 80 milligrams measured dose of caffeine. So that means you would take 80 milligrams an hour before the start of the race, and then in that first hour to hour and a half, 2 hours of the race, you would have the other 2 sachets. And generally, just make it easy for yourself, put it into the front hydration system of your bike. Or if you're a runner, ultra runner, put it into your first 2 soft flasks, and you'll take that obviously in that first part of the race and get your right dose. If the race is going beyond 6 hours, ladies, you want to be thinking about, again, having another one of those 3-serve doses at around or just prior to starting, at least prior to that 6-hour point in the race. And that could be, again, split as a single serve and then a double serve, within an hour, hour and a half of each other. So that's some really interesting data that really underwrites and substantiates, again, the role of caffeine for upregulating fat oxidation. We've known through a lot of the studies they have been centered on men, and we wanted to bring out here a study that was specific to women and show you that the benefit here of being able to preserve your glycogen by upregulating fat oxidation through the use of caffeine. I hope that helps. I hope you're enjoying the summer and getting some good training and racing in. All the best for the week ahead. Any questions, let us know. We'll be happy to help. Thanks again.